So Wilson was, I was a student of Wilson's at UBC when I arrived there straight out of New Zealand and was working on a PhD. I met Wilson early on, and he was one of my PhD supervisors. And Wilson was prepared to take students who were out of the box. Like I wasn't an anthropology student, but he was in anthropology. I was in history. But Wilson just was a source of so many interesting ideas about Northwest Coast cultures and people, and so willing to play around with ideas that it was very stimulating. And then throughout my career, doing a bunch of other things, I often thought, well, a biography of Wilson would be interesting. And then 10 years ago or so, I met Marnie Duff's daughter, and she suggested the idea. So that's how the book actually came to pass. First of all, I just thought Wilson's story needed to be told and heard. I thought that was important, but I thought it needed to be told and heard in his terms and in his context. So there's a lot of, these days, judging the past by the present. I think it's increasingly a problem. The past kind of disappears, and the past is only what we make of it in the present. It's not about actually understanding the past as the past, which I think you have to do first of all. That's what historians do. So I wanted to look at Wilson in his own context. Wilson was one of those brilliant people who you wouldn't pick out as a child to have such a career and be so influential. 1930s depression, working class family where the father was out of work. They lived in a house in South Vancouver. Went to UBC for a year, so he was old enough to join the Canadian Air Force and was a navigator on a Liberator bomber flying up and down the Malay Peninsula. That his crew flew about 100 missions bombing targets in Malaya. High risk stuff. After that, he came back to Vancouver, back to UBC, and there he met Harry Hawthorne, who was the newly appointed head of anthropology there and was building the department, looking for bright students. And he and Wilson met, and Wilson got turned on to anthropology. From UBC, he went to the University of Washington to start an MA under Erna Gunther, who was actually had been a student of Franz Boas. Before he'd finished his master's, Harry Hawthorne had arranged with Clifford Carl at the Provincial Museum for Wilson to become the provincial anthropologist. At the Provincial Museum, the first really in any way qualified provincial anthropologist. The space was small, the overcrowded, it wasn't, there's no climate control or anything like that. So it was a challenge. He set about working on the displays, first of all, and making sure that there was more First Nations content in the museum. And then, he just was thrown into the thick of many aspects of that job. First of all, finishing his MA thesis, which was later published on the ethnography of the Upper Stalo. As I said, working on the displays, answering inquiries, giving talks to school children and community groups. Most of the summers in the early going, up and down the coast and into the interior, in the field, meeting people, going to communities, and then getting involved in early on totem pole reclamation. In the meantime, he's working with Mungo Martin to rebuild Thunderbird Park, and in 1953, in the first potlatch after it was banned from the Indian Act, after the ban was dropped, the first potlatch after that is held in Wawaditla to open Mungo Martin's house. And then the totem pole reclamation, which became controversial later on, like in our time, it's seen to be a colonialist appropriation, was not seen that way at the time. And in any event, Wilson was really careful to get the permission of the people, the owners, and the band councils to remove those poles. And the Haida were very much involved in the expeditions. Represented most clearly by Bill Reed, who was up there involved in that process. Wilson did a fair amount of media work himself, publicizing what he was doing, including writing in the Native Voice, the newspaper for First Nations communities asking for advice on this. But yeah, there was one columnist, particularly in the Vancouver Sun, who just thought this was a complete waste of time and money. So Wilson was involved in, I mean, there's a fair amount of academic discussion about what word to use, but let me say the renewal or the revival of Northwest Coast art. Because he and Bill Reed agree that it wasn't in a good state in the 1950s. And they worked together a lot to bring it back to the anthropology department at UBC. So in 1965, he becomes a professor of anthropology. And I think he was responsible for educating, it sometimes seems like a generation of students about First Nations culture, history, and predicament, I would say. Well, the image is called Eagle Full Circle, and it's painted by Roy Henry Vickers. And that's an interesting story. So Wilson's at the Provincial Museum in the 50s, in the basement of the legislative building, and he sees this young boy who comes in several times to look at the Northwest Coast material. So Wilson strikes up a conversation, and they get talking about Northwest Coast art, and the boy's name is Roy Henry Vickers, and Roy attributes those conversations with Wilson to him becoming an artist. And so I did a wonderful interview with Roy when I was working on this, just so insightful. And then he let me use that image, which Eagle Full Circle, which he painted in memory of Wilson. And it's about life being a circle. And I think in Wilson's case, more than one circle. That's something else to talk about, maybe. And it's got all of the components of North. It's an eagle with its wings and a circle, and it's got all the components. And at the bottom of the image is a mother, which Roy said that's where we all start. And Wilson was certainly very close to his mother. So yeah, I mean, Wilson had that kind of influence on people.